Elaine and I have been invited to share with you some of our experience in responding to the call of the gospel and to reflect on the response to that call which some people make. By the call of the gospel, I mean the call to love one another and to respond to the needs and injustices we see or encounter on our life's journey. We're all familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. When we see someone in need, do we pass by on the other side, or do we figure out how we can help? And like all of you, I suspect, if we're honest with ourselves, we know that there are times when we pass by on the other side, but there are many times when we have stopped and helped or given our support to programs which are responding to the need. The call of the gospel comes in many forms. Sometimes it's when we read or hear of the suffering of people, such as the refugees held on Nauru or Manus Island, or those held in detention centres in Australia, or of the homeless living on our streets of Sydney, or the survivors of the tsunami in Indonesia, or of the families living in countries where there are virtually no health services. The list is long and seems to be growing every day. Then at other times, the call comes when we encounter situations face to face, and with our own eyes we see the reality of the need. In that moment, you're sometimes faced with a real-life choice. Do I continue on the path I've been following, or am I being called to take a different road? The first time I remember facing just such a decision was during the first period of our married life in the 1960s. When we were living at Bordertown, I was employed as a farm management advisor by some of the farmers in the district, and we had just started a family. But the times, they were a-changin'.
Many adults during the 60s had caught the vision of being actively engaged in social justice through the synergy of those times. Australia Frontier, an offshoot of the Australian Council of Churches, sponsored a wide range of community consultations to address community needs. They also invited progressive thinkers from overseas to visit Australia. One of these was Joseph Matthews from the Ecumenical Institute in Chicago. Several clergy and lay people attended some weekend courses he led, looking at the gospel as interpreted by some progressive theologians such as Rudolf Bultmann and Richard Niebuhr. Following this, some of those who had attended began offering similar weekend seminars across the country. John and I attended one of those weekends, which was prepared with intentionality and purposeful style. 3 separate sessions included a lecture, followed by a study of 3 contemporary theologians, with another couple of sessions using art form conversations which focused on the Guernica painting by Picasso and a modern movie called Requiem for a Heavyweight. This weekend was a momentous awakening of our spirit lives.
Then over the next couple of years, we met regularly with others who had attended such seminars and continued studying some of the progressive theology texts and spent time figuring out how we might apply those ideas in our work and community. Some of the members of this new spirit movement decided to live together in a community house in Paddington as they continued teaching weekend seminars, and each summer would organise a summer program over 2 to 3 weeks where people from across the country would come together and be inspired to continue their work back in their home territories. They also responded to an invitation to send a team to work with the Aboriginal community of Mowanjum near Derby in Western Australia, which had been run as a mission station for many years by the Presbyterian Board of Missions. The team that went from the Ecumenical Institute included Ron and Pam Denham. And this team invited me to visit Mowanjum to suggest possible agricultural enterprises the community could pursue, so I spent a few days there. It was the first time I'd ever been to an Aboriginal community because I'd grown up in West Gippsland, just east of Melbourne, and any Aboriginal people who had survived the invasion of their land there had been moved out of sight down to Lake Tyers. I'd heard of the missions run by various churches and had read a little about the paternalistic style of management of some of them. So when I visited Mowanjin, I did not know what to expect, but it was refreshing to see the EI team working alongside the Aboriginal people to help them regain their self-esteem and make their own decisions about how to practice their culture rather than be told by the Presbyterian mission staff who'd been there beforehand they could not have paintings of their creator being the Wandjina in the chapel. They now proudly had images of Wandjina alongside the Christian symbols. After that, I returned home to Bordertown to reflect on whether I would continue my career in agriculture, or was I being called to join this group who were forging a new pathway in how non-Indigenous Australians could interact with Indigenous Australians.
The summer program in 1972 was very significant in the Australian Spirit Movement story. This is where the excitement became a serious question of decision, which involved a big commitment. Australian people involved in the Spirit Movement were energetic and very receptive to these revolutionary plans for Australia. They had decided it would be good to establish 5 community houses in Australia. We actually were part of that decision, but we hadn't realised what we were saying yes to too much. Although many of us had attended religious studies weekend courses, we hadn't envisioned that some of us would need to be the ones to enable this wild revolution to become a reality. Hearing the compelling biblical reading and the word Samuel, Samuel, and the scripture story was the call to service, which included establishing those community houses across Australia. These words still ring clear.
Having seen what was happening in Mowanjin, I was ready to say yes to the call, but how would Elaine respond?
This has been the hardest decision I've ever made in my entire life. I thought of a proviso to give me more time to consider such a huge option. We had been trying to sell a small block of land. It sold in 3 weeks. I still needed time to think things through. It's the only time I've thought rather seriously about divorce. As I was a mother of 3 young children between the years of 7 and 2.5. By the end of February, our family of 2 adults and 3 children, Catherine, Michelle and Amanda, along with their favourite dolls and toys, drove from Bordertown to Adelaide in our car with a friend's trailer carrying our personal possessions, which included a 20-foot chest freezer filled with our clothes and a lounge suite to Adelaide House for our intern year.
We then spent the next 16 years under assignment with the Order Ecumenical, 10 years in Australia, followed by Southeast Asia and Africa, where the children were not with us. Elaine has now some vignettes of those years. They'll give you some idea of the challenges we faced, but also the rich experience of living and working in different cultural environments.
These vignettes are some of my journal entries that I went to look for preparing this today. Written at various times throughout the decades, living in community as the Order Ecumenical, with our public face being the Institute of Cultural Affairs. This is a significant day and a significant year. We've arrived in Hong Kong and our 10th year of living in community. In the beginning of this revolution, people were captivated by the need for the new within the church. In 1972, the Global Order in Chicago had the theme of the turn to the world, which for some clergy was rather scary, having to embrace the real world beyond the church. It was like we were looking for the profound. We were part of those who could see the introversion of the historical church. Many of us were captured by the new that we could see in the practical laying down one's life. Where is society now? One of our key symbols has been the wedge blade, standing between the no longer and the not yet and forging a new path. I was caught this week in Hong Kong with the image of what is the wedge we need to forge into history. This week I've been teaching at the Sarabiti College located in Wan Chai. What is the new for the Language English Department? What's the new for Hong Kong, for Asia? What's the new for the world? Some things in Aboriginal communities became very clear that our grandiose ideas were sometimes the ones that failed. What's the wedge in these times we need to forge into history? I'm glad my cage was rattled this week. And now we move to Africa, the continent, October 83. Now in Kapini, the Community Development Project, 15 miles north of Lusaka, with a 2-kilometre walk from the main road to the centre. We as the order are made up of diverse individuals. By providence, I was born into a Christian family. I cannot change that. I was born into a nation less than 50% the population of Zambia. The first 9 years of being part of this order was spent in the same nation, Australia. That was a gift and is also who I am. For the past 2 years, I lived in Hong Kong, which was about as different as Kapini, as Hong Kong was from Murrumbidgee. Everything is a contrast. I exchanged my Murrumbidgee jeans for a business suit in Hong Kong, a dilly bag for a business satchel. No public signs in Hong Kong were in English. Those 2 years have now become who I am. Here in Lusaka, we are one team with one focus, each member having the same stipend base. Each person is unique and unrepeatable, individual gifts to enrich the corporate body. The order is not a static form, but continually evolving. At the end of 84, Order Council will be putting form onto our pioneering edge in society for the future. This will only be possible by input from the 170 locations. This year we will be about writing the story which will become the authentic one for the following year. In December 83, from a letter I had written to my brother, I found a very good description of the work and what we did in Zambia. During this month we have engaged in a whole new phase of work in Zambia, initiating work in a new ward each month. A ward varies in size, but is the smallest formal government division, comprising anywhere between 50 to 100 villages. We initially do a one-day planning meeting with clusters of villages from across the whole ward. Then invite representatives from these clusters to a week-long village leaders training program here in Kapini. Following that, we send one of our teams to visit each cluster once a month for 2 days to help the village leaders evaluate the past month's achievements and to plan the next month's activities. The response to date from the villages has been very encouraging. This past week, we had 16 leaders from these villages and the district officer from the Department of Social Development attend. He had his life changed when he saw how he could work with people as an alternative to the top-down approach which most bureaucracies adopt. A year later, this is some of how life was in Zambia. It's raining in Kapini. It only rains for 4 months each year in this part of the world. The rain is so welcome, but the truck is bogged by the windmill. The 40 mattresses have not arrived for the Human Development Training School due to start later next week. The borrowed car cannot go into reverse and there's a flat tyre. The Stocking family couple is sick. The gas bottle had run out a couple of nights ago, so no dinner could be cooked for the 20 adults and the 5 children that night because we'd forgotten to kick-roll the gas bottle to the road 2 kilometres to be carried on the Matatu truck for replacement in Lusaka. The renter-killed man then brings us a filled cylinder out, along with usually about 3 sacks of red beans, rice, and polenta. Polenta is the Nshima's favourite food. All right, okay.
So that gives you some idea of some of the challenges which you face when you're working in different locations. In addition to encountering such challenges, one of the joys of living in Zambia was to experience their cultural rituals. We were invited to an event where local villagers who had completed a health workers course were to receive their certificates. The ceremony began and soon the local member, MP Mavis Mayunda, who was to present the certificates, was introduced. She spoke for about 1 minute and then stepped down from behind the microphone and began to dance, and was quickly joined by everyone else. Dancing went on for perhaps 5 minutes, and then she went back to the mic and continued with her speech. This was a common practice at events in Zambia where people sing and dance a lot. So that's just a sort of example of how you get the feedback or the experience, the joy of working in these different places. So now a little bit of reflection. What does it take to step out into the unknown where there are no guarantees about how it's going to turn out? The willingness to risk failure is one of those. Sometimes it takes a lot of courage to divert from the known to the comfortable. Sometimes you may find yourself in life-threatening situations. For example, when I was working with Care Australia in the Middle East after the first Gulf War in 1992, I was based in Amman, but we had staff on the ground in 3 locations in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, each working with the local people to distribute food and kerosene. Each of the foreign staff had a price on their head, and they couldn't dine out at local restaurants for fear of being targeted. But being in such situations also calls for ingenuity and creativity. As Elaine has already mentioned, and as the reading from Corinthians has said, we all have different gifts, so when we work together, amazing things can happen. Some seemingly impossible situations can be transformed. It calls for us to have faith, hope and love, and a belief that such transformation is possible. It means trusting in the mystery, or God, tapping into the river of consciousness, that river which carries us along through life and which keeps being expanded and enriched through many varied experiences, and being willing to climb the mountain of care. Then we may experience the sea of tranquility, not a sea where everything is calm, but where you may experience tranquility even though the next moment a wave may come crashing down on you. And as the contemporary reading said, the peace of mind you get here is a peace that passes all rational understanding. It's a kind of problemlessness in the midst of trials. There's a kind of joy unspeakable, the joy of sticking your fist into the deeps of life.